Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra metagame breakdown. We are in the second week of the last balance patch and things are about to sort of settle and establish themselves in a pretty clear way, and we're gonna see a bunch of noteworthy changes from last week, some of which I noted in my testing in the meantime as well, and it's nice to see that the data seems to move in a similar direction and back up my personal impressions and experience. So, you know the drill. Before we dive into the data, hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't yet to not miss out on future content, and let me briefly introduce you to today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN, one of the leading virtual private network providers out there. A virtual private network keeps your data secure and yourself anonymous while using the internet. NordVPN comes with super fast servers, allows you to unlock your favorite entertainment websites like Netflix. They provide a 30-day money-back guarantee. They also have an included cybersecurity suite, which acts as an ad blocker to boot. They don't lock any of your data, provide a 24/7 customer support, and you can use it on up to 6 simultaneous connections, so one account covers most or all of your electronic devices. And most importantly, they don't have any bandwidth limit, so you can use it non-stop without it getting throttled, which is particularly important for heavy users like us. It also won multiple awards and comes highly recommended by top technology experts. So if you're still surfing online without a VPN, now is the time to change that. Get NordVPN now, 70% off for a 3-year plan, including 1 month extra for free using the code ManuS or the personalized link in the description down below. And now on to today's content. Alright, so also I made a small change. As you can see, I decided to try and add a little more context. So I add the games played as well as the win rate, and then sort of do it the other way around for the win rate games to give you a bit better idea of how the decks are doing relative to their popularity or how popular they are relative to their performance. Just add a little more context. Let me know in the comments how you feel about it. I thought it might add to the whole thing. So first in 5th place we have the Anivia-Braum deck. That deck was doing really well initially. Now it's further and further declining, which is not too surprising. I think the deck is quite good, but I wasn't quite convinced that it was like a top tier 1 type deck, and it seems like it might be more of a good tier 2 deck that has some inherent issues or weaknesses, because it feels like it doesn't have the same kind of raw power as some of the other decks have. So you have to work really hard for a win rate that is fine but not exceptional, while in some of the other decks, your deck just has so much raw power that you don't even need to work that hard. You just kind of, unless your opponent is also playing a really high quality deck, you're often not even having much opposition, which means you get a lot more and easier wins against a lot of like variety of decks where your power level gives you a leg up, where otherwise you might be more dependent on how good your draw is in the given game, or how well the matchup dynamically plays out for you. While if your power level discrepancy is high enough between your deck and their deck, it doesn't matter if it might be structurally a bad matchup or your draw might be kind of bad, because you're still probably ahead of what your opponent is doing just based on raw power. And this deck seems to be a bit short on the raw power. Seems like this particular list that is popular right now, some people are experimenting with some Ice Veil archers, but other than that, it's still basically the same deck. So yeah, not too much change here, but I think it's shifting more into its deserved spot, and we could even see it falling out of the top 5 popularity based on how it's doing, from my impression. But it might not, simply because it's fairly unique in the sense that it's the only sort of competitive hardcore control deck in the game right now. So people that prefer that will play this over a higher win rate deck of another archetype that they don't enjoy as much, which is understandable to an extent. So if this is the best control deck, there is this preference effect that I just talked about that makes it more likely to inflate its popularity relative to if there would be 2 hardcore control style decks, and one would be better, the other would probably drop in popularity drastically because people would just all play the better version. There's not much alternative. Either you play this deck if you want to play this style of deck, or you play a different style of deck, basically a different style of archetype. And yeah, preferences are strong enough for a lot of people to gravitate towards what they like if it's good enough to be competitive, even though it's not as good as some of the other options. All right. Next, we have Demacia Scouts. The general trend here seems to be towards Lucian over Quinn. Also in the performance, the Lucian variants seem to do better than normal. This is a compounding of the Lucian and Quinn versions, which together end up with this amount of games played, since they are basically still the same archetype, just different variations of it. So I added them together. The win rate is also a compounded one of the end of all Demacia Bilgewater decks, which is mostly Quinn or Lucian Misfortune Scout decks. There isn't really any other archetypes in that region combination, making it pretty easy to take the overall win rate of the region combination as a representative. Also noteworthy here is this list is the most popular, but only by like 5 games. The other list is a Quinn list that also happens to have a bit better performance. I'm highly skeptical of this particular take. Navigator over Petty Officer and no Bannerman in particular seems very questionable, but this is the most popular list for the Lucian version and almost tied for the most popular version of the archetype with the most popular Quinn list. So even within that, there seems to be neck and neck, even though there are overall a lot more games played with Lucian variants than Quinn variants, almost like 2 to 1, like 900 something of these games are Lucian variant and 500 something are Quinn variants. I personally have been a bit underwhelmed with the deck, but it still seems to be doing pretty well. My recent testing didn't do that well, and to be fair, if you compare it to Harrowing Noxus, which is a similar type of deck and kind of appeals to the same players and the same stuff and so on, I honestly don't really see why you would play this over Harrowing Noxus so far. It didn't seem like it's particularly favored against Harrowing Noxus or overall has any notable upsides over the Harrowing Noxus aggro deck. If anyone has any opinions on that in the comments, let me know. I'm happy to discuss it. From my limited testing so far with this archetype, it just felt like a worse aggro deck than the Noxus deck, basically, which is why I'm not too interested in playing this too much. I might give it another shot, but if it keeps performing and feeling the way that it has, I'll probably just abandon it and don't worry about it too much anymore. Next we have the Ezreal Twisted Fate deck. This deck has gained in popularity but notably lost in performance, which is not too surprising. The deck is really powerful against certain decks and really bad against certain other decks. Like it really struggles with decks curving out with real units with good stats like Noxus, Demacia, that sort of stuff. And especially given how strong Noxus is and Harrowing against this deck, I'm not too surprised this deck isn't doing very well. I think this is very clearly a tier 2 deck that is inflated in popularity due to its coolness and how good it can feel when it works, but it just feels like there's a fair share of matchups where you just kind of have very little chance from the get-go, independent of how the game goes, how the draws play out or whatever, because you're just so inherently disadvantaged that you just lose pretty consistently. Like, for example, the Noxus matchup in my experience. I played this deck a bunch because I think it's cool and I like it, and I like that it has a more aggressive, more forward momentum. It sort of has this kind of aggro plan implemented in it inherently, which is nice, while still having all the like Twisted Fate and Ezreal stuff that you can do. So you have a lot of cool angles, but it's really poor at dealing with a curve of efficient units in my experience, and that's a huge problem. Not the biggest fan of this specific list. Camp Punk doesn't add a whole lot, makes your Grifter even worse, which is already pretty stretched. Considering the fact that we also just getting the Pilfered Goods nerf, yeah, I don't have high hopes for this. I think this will drop in win rate and in popularity even more, and will probably fade out as an unremarkable tier 2 deck pretty soon, if I had to guess. Which is unfortunate, it's cool, but yeah, I don't think it's actually that good. Then we have Vi-Heimerdinger. Same old, same old. We're seeing the first change now with the change to Monk, which might mean this deck actually wants to drop Monk for, say, Campunk Pickpocket, or another 3-drop option, or another spell, maybe Concussive Palm, which is both a unit and a spell, and also a turn 3 play potentially in this deck. So that seems like an interesting option. Otherwise, the deck is still intact. They are discussing changes to Heimerdinger's turrets, which might ultimately make this deck fall out of favor and be dethroned as one of the format-defining high-skill tier 1 decks. Otherwise, no changes here really. Win rate has been going down a bit, but it's still pretty high up there in the win rates, and just kind of fluctuating. The matchup against Noxus seems kind of rough for the deck, which is why the deck is performing less good than in a couple of weeks ago, but otherwise it's still the same deck. And it's not like it's hopeless or horrible against that deck, it's just not as favorable of a matchup as a lot of the other matchups have been in the past. And most popular archetype by far is still, and even more so than before, the Noxus-Harrowing aggro. I compounded the Draven Darius and Elise Darius variants together because they're basically the same deck except with 3 more Shadow Isles champions over 3 more Noxus champions, and otherwise basically the same cards. Yeah, overall win rate pretty decent, kind of brought down by the Elise variants actually, which overall have about almost 2 to 2.5% lower win rate. Super popular, like almost twice as popular as any other deck. Not too surprising, deck is really powerful. We might see some toning down in the next balance patch to this to make it a bit more manageable again. They already mentioned that they are considering changes to direct Nexus damage on lower cost Noxus units. Alright, this brings us to the top 5 highest win rate decks. So in 5th place we have a bit of a surprising deck. The best performing Ezreal deck right now seems to be the old Draven Ezreal deck sneaking in there. Not entirely sure I like Draven better than, say, Swain in a Noxus Ezreal deck, but I certainly see the appeal of Noxus Ezreal. If you remember, I had my Swain Ezreal deck tech 2 weeks ago or so. Quite like the deck, did pretty decent with it. I would probably prefer that over this. I'm really just not seeing why Draven should be worth it here. It just doesn't play as well into the sort of controlling nature of this deck. It doesn't have enough of an aggressive plan, I think, for Draven to be that great. Sure, Axis and Rummage are nice, but it's still not that great. I'm highly skeptical of Draven being the way to go for Noxus Ezreal. But at least here in 5th place it made it in with 57.3%. A bit less than 400 games, so not a big sample size, but I figured it's big enough to put it in relative to the win rate, because the alternatives would have just been even lower sample size or like lower win rate decks to a point where they're not even deserving of the top 5 really. Because once you end up with like 55-56%, your win rate is so mediocre among reasonably competitive, reasonably playable decks that yeah, you don't deserve to be in the top 5, and it's kind of distorting. So I rather put some less cemented, more promising stuff in there that could turn out better or worse with a larger sample size. Next we have Vi-Heimerdinger, actually only coming in 4th here. The decks are all pretty close together, so don't be too surprised. But yeah, 59.1% in 4th place, like I said, dropping down a bunch because the Noxus matchup is not exactly the easiest. And the scouts are also not exactly a free win either. So there's some pressure from the aggressive curve decks on this deck, making it more manageable, but still clearly, as you can see, overall very strong. Next we have the Demacia Bilgewater Scout deck again. 59.6% win rate over both versions. This is the highest win rate version, which happens to be a Quinn version. Wasn't that high of a sample size, like 170 something games, but the win rate was like 68%, 5% higher than the similar sample size Quinn variant. So I opted to choose this. Also, it's a more sound version to me, given that it is playing Bannerman, which I think you absolutely have to. It's just too powerful and too easy to play because there's so many good Demacia cards anyway. Then we have a more sort of speculative deck still that a guy on NA, I don't remember the name, has been contesting rank 1 with like a couple days ago a bunch, and I think BBG among others has been championing it since and playing it. And this is BBG's version with 2 Björk, where the other version had a 3rd Demolitionist and 1 Avalanche, and also was running Everose and Sentry over Archer, but otherwise it's the same list. Deck's pretty solid. I played it a bunch. I think I went like 7-4 over 11 games, which is pretty reasonable. I still feel like the deck has its issues because it's not very good at dealing with like bigger threats. It's more like kind of machine gunning down like small and medium-sized stuff and doing pretty well there. But once again, you're still quite vulnerable to a Harrowing out of the Noxus deck, for example. You're not good at dealing with Darius in a lot of spots, especially on turn 6. Later on, you have bigger units. So, yeah, certainly a very solid and promising deck, but probably a bit overhyped. We'll probably see the win rate adjust a little bit downward, I would think, because it seems like it's a bit overperforming, partially probably because not that large of an audience is playing it yet, so it's mostly played by a few dedicated, quite skilled people, while the win rates of other archetypes contain a sample size of a larger range of skill in Master, while this is more condensed towards dedicated players to the archetype and higher skilled players. But yeah, it's at least probably a pretty interesting, good tier 2 deck that has a different angle and is worth exploring. And maybe it's even good enough for a tier 1 deck, but I'm not quite sold on that yet. And in first place, we have Noxus Shadow Isles, 1795 games, 60.4% win rate. This is only the amount of games and win rate from the Draven Darius variants. I specifically excluded the Elise variants because their win rate is more than 2% lower. Let me check. It's exactly 2.4% lower. So I didn't want to distort the archetype's performance by lumping in a clearly inferior variant. I talked about why that is inferior in my deck tech at length, and it makes a lot of sense that it performs notably worse because hitting your Basilisk Riders is super important. So yeah, swapping your Draven with an Elise just isn't worth it. It's not a relevant gain in power on that axis, while a notable loss on power on the rider axis. So makes a lot of sense that this version has a significantly higher win rate, and therefore I separated them for the win rate analysis because there was reasonable assumption to do so, while I thought for the popularity assumption it makes sense to lump them together because they're still basically the same deck, but it doesn't make sense to artificially reduce the win rate of the better version by including a both theoretically and statistically worse version when we're looking at win rates, since yeah, you don't need to play the Elise version, you just play the Draven version and then you're on the right side of things, while in terms of popularity since people also play the inferior version, we gotta count that in, if that makes sense. All right. So yeah, that's where we're headed. I think a lot of these changes make sense. Ezreal Twisted Fate seemed highly inflated last week, and not surprised to see it where it's now. Noxus keeps thriving. It's just a very good deck. The deck is notably better than I initially thought it might be. Thought it was pretty solid, pretty good initially, but wasn't sure if it's actually going to be that great. But the more I played it, the more I believe it's actually like actively really great and a very good deck. And yeah, pretty rewarding deck in terms of power level and consistency and matchups to just play and climb with, really. And quite a solid amount of play as well, despite what people might think. All right, that's it again for this week. Those are our top 5 most popular and top 5 highest win rate decks. Discrepancy isn't that big anymore. We had 2 like lower sample size potential up-and-comers in the win rate, basically. Otherwise, win rate and popularity are pretty close to each other. We'll see the 2 like sort of high popularity, medium win rate decks possibly shift down further in the future, would be my prediction. And yeah, as usual, let me know in the comments what you think. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, turn on notification icon to not miss out on future content, and show the sponsors some love in the description. Don't miss out on your NordVPN deal, or get the deck tracker that I'm using if you like it. And yeah, all other information can also be found in the description by clicking more, show more as usual. Yeah, that's it again for this time. I'm your host, ManuS. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.